lunch together. And I'd like to know what Kartika thinks about the book, actually. Would be
That's not fair.
yeah, just what does she think, and why did she publish it? And she stayed with this book for 13 years. It's a very long investment for a publisher, for a literary novel, which, literary fiction doesn't sell much. So this was not about huge numbers. So she stayed with this book for a long while. I'd really love to know why she did that.
That's like putting me on the spot a bit, but is it okay if I actually try and answer this with utmost sincerity? um, so I think I've published fiction for 25 years now, edited fiction for that many years. And I think the thing that is becoming more and more difficult in our Indian English fiction world is to find someone who's willing to invest their time and memory and effort into telling a story that is a big canvas story. I think it's more and more the fiction that one reads is either of a particular time, which is a limited time. And of course, this is a bit of a generalization. But when I think back to the kind of books that I'm publishing, for instance, or editing or working on, I think a lot of it is to do with specificity, which does not go beyond into a rather larger canvas of, say, history and memory of a nation sort of situation. And I think there are languages, fiction in the languages seems to do that a lot more from what I've read than in the English language. And I think that is partly why when Som started writing this novel, which is actually such an expansive novel, which seeks to tell a big story through the lives of a few characters, which is a huge challenge, obviously, because you have so many perspectives, but you also have, you have to tell it from the outside in a sense, right? You can't, these four people cannot possibly cover the whole gamut of what is going on in Assam or that whole region. So that challenge, I think, is what makes this book work so well. The fact that there are these fully fleshed out characters. We know all things about them that can possibly be known about a character in a book. And yet we also are always seeing the city, the nation, the bigger patterns of the way relationships work between institutions, whether it's the army and the state, or whether it's the terrorist sort of person and the state, or the activist and the state. All of these things are there, but they are done particularly through the lives of the story. So we never lose sight of the emotional core of the novel. We never lose sight of what is going on in the mind of a character and why they're responding to what they're responding to. And I think connected with that is also the fact that the strength of this novel, I felt for the reader particularly, is the detailing of it, is the nuance of it. Take any scene, take the scene where the little girl on the train, with the family's traveling and she gets taken away. Every little thing, from what the men are wearing to their little conversations to where they slept on the berth, how they sat, everything is so visual that you are on that train with the characters. If it's about the flag hoisting thing that goes wrong, in the sense the wrong national anthem is sung at the end of it, you can, I can still feel the ground beneath my feet walking through that enclave. The way where Ghosh Baba was sleeping, where his wife is giving him khana to eat, how he's sitting, like every little thing is just dropped onto the page in a way that you don't notice the amount of detailing that is happening. You only capture in your mind, you're getting a whole cohesive image. But I think what happens is if you look at the words on the page, you see how many words went into and how many phrases and little details went into creating that cohesive image for you. And that connection, I think, between the characters, the storytelling, plus the details that add up to it at every level for an editor, it's a hugely satisfying thing to be able to even get your teeth into a novel like that, to be able to work away at it, to look at the sentences, to imagine that, and to to grow your own imagination with the imagination of the writer as the novel proceeds. I think there's just so many reasons, Som, that I love this novel. And yes, I know that it has a particular resonance for people who live in Assam, but I spent early 90s in Delhi. And in Delhi, there was, it was a bad time from the 84 Sikh riots, killings onwards to what was going on in the 90s with security. It was a time when you went to the bus and it said things like "look under the seat," and so we know what it was like, and it felt like though it was not Assam, and I'm reading it in Delhi, I could I could recognize those situations, and everything about it felt so particular, so local, so much of a particular place and region. But at the same time, it was so easy to amplify it into your experience somewhere else, and that transcending that time and place, I think, is also what so managed with the river, which is to be specific to the Red River, but it could be anywhere, anytime as well. So, all of these reasons, I just think that this novel is marvelous and just really takes on the challenge of telling a good old fashioned story in so many ways, which is not, it's a hard thing to do, to hold the reader's attention by telling a story, which seems on the surface very simple. Three boys are growing up, they're different, things happen differently to them. But to encompass a whole nation in that story and a whole time and multiple nations, really, that I think is the triumph of the novel, and which is why Somnath, I think that this is a very special novel to have come out of India.
My
I
13
spoke too
years
much.
is worth it. No,
I spoke too much.
no, done. You've paid off my 13 years. That's it. um, uh,
No, how did you react to it, Udita?
As I already, I think I said this. So when I bought the novel and I started reading it, it was merely for research because I'm working on migrant literature from Assam. But as I delved more and more into the novel, I think parts of it became very personal, and I could relate to it at so many levels because, as I said, that it connects to some very fundamental human emotions and experiences, and it does so very effortlessly. And the lyrical quality of the novel, of course, and definitely the history, the way it connects so many things together, it binds so many things together in such a wonderful way. All of that appealed to me. But there's a portion, I have some of my favorite parts from the novel, and a portion about there's a Bengali word called paichari. I think it's
Yeah,
towards the end of the novel,
yeah.
and that part is somewhere I just welled up. And I would, if time permits, I would request Professor Batabyal to read out that part from the novel. I think it would be amazing to hear it in his voice.
Yeah, which is a beautiful part of the novel. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
both Karthika and I have welled up writing it.
Yeah, every single time. So there are some parts where, like, every time I would come to where that train scene happens, and I have read it a few times. Uh, each time I would be like, no, no, no. This time it's not gonna. Something is gonna make it not happen. And it's not every novel that can do to you that that you know where you're headed, and you still feel invested in hope that things will not go.
Yes, yes.
When Ritsu gets hit on the head, um, even there, I knew this was going to come at the end of the session. I mean, of that section. But I would hope every single time that this time when I turn that page, it would be different. And it wasn't, and it would cause me the same heartbreak each time. Uh, that's not a minor achievement, I think, for a novelist.
And kind of following up on what Kartika was talking about, there's a sense of hope in the novel, despite everything that has been portrayed. There's a sense of optimism. At least I could feel that, and I actually had a question about that. So the novel definitely it engages with the politics of belonging and alienation across multiple dimensions, and it portrays the simultaneous reinforcing and deconstruction of the internal external borders in many ways, of course. So my question is, to what extent, like, have you witnessed the fluidity that you are portraying in the novel? And was it a conscious choice on your part to depict a different kind of discourse? Because hate narratives are very prevalent. So I really like the part where, people are crossing these borders, not just by, crossing across the rivers, but also crossing the borders in terms of how linguistic divides are being blurred, how ethnic divides are being, dismantled. So I was really wondering if you did it like very consciously, or is it came very experientially?
Uh, it's a difficult question to answer again, like, like the novel itself is a broad question. I don't think much came planned in this novel. I had only planned the first 3 chapters, which set out the prologue, and everything else that followed uh, pretty much happened. Once the main, for me, the main character is Lucky, the mother. The 3 boys are come later. Once Lucky arrived, and she just kind of took hold of the novel and led me on. Um, you so I think hope. It's an interesting word, and I mean, and there's a sense of hope. I think my sense of hope comes from the experiential. Um, the fact that I have a 10-year-old boy who says he's half English, half Indian, or sometimes full English and full Indian. Um,
Yeah.
you'll see that we have engaged uh, with languages, cultures, nations that have oppressed us. The oppressor and the oppressed come together in my son. And he's a beautiful amalgamation of what the possibilities are of reconciliation. I mean, Summer's return to Assam is in fact the idea of reconciliation. I mean, you're an academic audience, so I can probably use Nietzsche. Uh, Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, that things should weigh heavy on you, because if you do it once, it comes back again and again in history. We believe that Hitler will never happen again. Despite what is going on around the world, we rest on the idea of eternal non-recurrence, right? So therefore, reconciliations are possible. We can go back to things, and there's always hope. Sometimes I lose it, when things like the world that is now at the moment, present day conflicts, which we see so starkly. Uh, but yes, the fact that my father migrated in 1942 as a 6-year-old from Dhaka before partition, walking all the way from Dhaka to Kolkata. He was 6 years old. His brother was poor. His mother was pregnant. Um, and he grew up in a refugee colony. Now, his grandson, whom he has never met, is growing up in an Islington borough, right? I don't mean the material difference, but I mean the movement of people. I mean, and my son carries his grandfather's name. Is Robicho Manas Batabyal. My father was Manas. So, there is always hope. There is always, despite such, I mean, partition was the largest mass migration, people's movement in history, in recorded history. That was it. From that to here is a long distance traveled. And there are a million stories which will never be told. So I had that weight on me. I wanted to tell my father's story. I wanted to tell his mother's story, his father's story. And I wanted to give that sense of hugeness and how when we think of agency in a way, in complex agency, we have nothing in that, right? Um, a human endeavor sometimes can matter so little, and sometimes it does, sometimes it matters. So all of this sense of things, I don't know what it finally came out as. I had no final destination to reach, um, except that the story had to end sometime, and Kartika put a stop to, that's it, it's done. There was really no place. I was just kind of meandering along, and but it turned out that it was quite a tight narrative. It kept the pages turning, and a story was told. But it was not preconceived. The ending definitely wasn't. I had some notion of the first 3 chapters I knew very well before I started. And then the boyhood stories was just fun. It was just brilliant to think about how we spent our time before television and mobile phones, and the sheer charm and joy of boyhood. I don't think I've answered your question if there was one, but I just wanted to give a sense of, I mean, what I wanted to do is I very clearly wanted to write a old-fashioned 1940s, 90s, 1950s long, what we in Bengali call upannash. I wanted to go back to that genre of writing without thinking of how many pages, and how many words. So this book actually was more than 2.5 times what you have now. It was over 260,000 words, the first draft. And Karthik had to really, take me in hand and cut it down to about 100,000. So, which was a mammoth task. It took about 4.5 years to just edit the book. So it is a labor of love, and I'm very glad that for your appreciation and for your reading. I'm very, very grateful.
If you know what you said about Lucky being the main character, I think that's possibly. I mean, I'm only thinking about it when Udita said this, but it feels like maybe that's why there is that sense of hope, because I mean, she goes through such bad times, but she's smiling towards the end. She's like, "Oh, okay, there's life, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go to Gopalpur. I'm going to, I bought it, and I'm going to set up stuff there." That kind of it's like a life really lived hard, but eventually it's also, you leave us with that sense of hope, and even that of the memory of Amol walking, the boy thinking about his father with tenderness and not bitterness, uh, with her thinking about what lies ahead, instead of, as a woman who's lived such a big life, for her you might think should be thinking about slowing down, but she's setting out on a new mission now. Maybe in doing all of that, you gave us that sense of hope too, because it's Lucky and not the others you left us with.
Perhaps, and also I think the river. We start with the river and we end with the river and the
Yeah.
visions of, and rivers everywhere is a sense of both hope and destruction. The Brahmaputra
Mhm.
especially, as much as it gives life and as this alluvial soil in Assam, which has so much bounty, every year it kills. So I think
Mm.
so both work perhaps. Again, I didn't do it consciously, but now that you were mentioning Lucky, we started with Lucky, we ended with Lucky. And Lucky, I mean, the name itself, it's in a sense, it's ironical that we call somebody who has gone through so much Lucky. And yeah,
I
maybe
remember there was a time when we thought that could be the title of the book, and
yeah,
then we moved away from it.
yes,
Yeah,
for a long
because she
while.
was so central. But Udita, when you read it, did you think she was central to the novel, or is that Som's conception of the novel? What does the reader make of it?
Not sure if I can call her the central character, but definitely a very significant role she has. And I was actually intrigued by the very idea that the women characters in the novel, they are going through so much, yet they are emerging triumphant, and and they are all like, they are surviving through it. Unfortunately, the men are not. So both Rizu and Rana, they don't make it. I mean, they die, but even Leela, for that matter, was a very interesting character for me because the way her trajectory unfolded. So, sorry, coming back to your point about Lucky. Yes, I mean, she was a kind of thread which, connected a lot of, uh, you know, all the points together. And, uh, but somehow my mind would always think that Summer is the central character of the novel and not Lucky. Maybe because uh, I have read it a little more from, Summer's perspective. I have understood and perceived it more from his perspective. Maybe that's the reason. And
And also you see him the first person narration also, I guess.
yeah.
That, yeah.
I have a question for both Kartika and Dr. Batabyal. That is about the cover image of the book. Again, for everybody who hasn't actually seen this. So this cover image was very interesting because this shows, I think this character was called Geeta, and she's going away on an elephant. But Geeta is a minor character in the novel, and she doesn't appear, I think, more than twice. I don't think she appears more than twice. So I just want what thought went into, putting her in the cover, and if not a prequel about her is in works, I'm not sure about that, or if she was not washed away in the 160,000 words that were removed, I'm not sure about that. But I would really like to know that. Of course, I understand the mysteriousness that she adds to the cover, but if anything else was in your mind.
So,
I mean, Kartika, the publishers decide the cover. The writer has no role.
but we discussed this, right? And we did think about multiple scenes. One of the things that you wanted on the cover, I remember when we started, was the boys playing cricket. And I think we thought about that and tried it, but I think with the elephant, it was a bit like showing, this is a big novel, and one wanted to communicate that this is expansive, and it's of course the river. So we had to the earlier thing, we also were trying to think about different titles maybe, and we thought that would also fit with the boys playing cricket, etc. When we thought about Lucky as the title, we thought of a completely different cover, which would be more based on just on the name Lucky, like big type and all of that. We imagined that. But I think when we settled on the title, which is something Som was very keen on having Red River there, then I think it became an obvious choice to have something to do with the river. And when we thought of the river, then and if you look at it, yes, Geeta is not central in the same way as the other characters are, but what she does makes so many things happen. It's what happens with her and the elephant. I mean, that allows us to see the fractures within the family, that heightens the conflict within that house where, brother or sister divided. Everything, the tension there is all because of what happened with Geeta and the elephant. And later, when she has to leave and they flee, and Amol, well, is left behind, what happens there is also something that Geeta is the catalyst for. She, in a sense, causes it to happen by what she did. And she's in that, accidentally, Kabir is lost to Lucky. So there are many things that Geeta is a catalyst for, and the elephant and Geeta are. And so it all just, I feel like the subtlety and the things that are unsaid in the novel, the elephant walking away with her is also the last image in the novel. So somewhere it felt right that you would read the last page and you would put the book down, and then when you looked at the cover, you would say, "Yeah, I'm back at the beginning and I've seen the ending, and it all comes together really nicely now in this one image." That's what we hoped would happen when you looked at it.
And it's such a beautiful cover. It's so
Yeah.
beautiful. It's like when I saw it, and when Kartika was sending me different versions, I just kept looking at it and thinking, my God, how, there are covers you just love. And I thought the entire we mentioned mystery, but the kind of red tinge, the feeling of it was very either dusk, Godhuli, which I mention in the book. There's a passage
Mm.
I really like, or very early morning, which I also really like. And both of the times, in Guwahati, in those days, could be very, very beautiful. So yeah, I had all those memories which immediately flooded. But also an elephant, and points to migration, points to loss of spaces to live. There's so much politics around um, forests and vanishing landscapes in Assam and elsewhere. So, the migration is not only for humans. So for me, that was also a moment of thinking that where does these elephants go? All the tea gardens being built, the things we celebrate so much in Assam now, economic success, it's at a lot of cost. An elephant is, though we don't speak about it, is at the forefront of what we are losing out.
Yeah, and then we had that last minute panic where we found that the elephant had African ears
I was going to keep quiet
instead of
about
the
it.
Asian elephant's ears. So then the artist had to quickly redo the back with the shape of it. Yeah.
There's a very interesting story about this, Kartika, if I may.
Oh,
Kartika's Kartika's husband and my dear friend is Vivek Menon. Vivek is a really big uh, person in the wildlife and conservation and a lot of things in India. He's the director of the WTI, Wildlife Trust of India, and his special passion is elephants. So Kartika showed him a rough image of the cover, and this cover was taken from a generic photo, an Adobe photograph. But the ears were
African.
and Vivek said, "What are you guys doing? This is not an Assamese elephant." So this is at the last minute that this was changed. So if not for
Yeah. Then he quickly pulled out his laptop and gave us some
and
image references and photographs of how elephants look when they walk away and they are Asian.
yeah,
Delicacy.
serendipity. No, we were very lucky. This would have been a huge mistake to
Yeah,
make.
correct. Yeah. So the
But
backstories are what you're hearing now of how
but
near
production
bungles
first.
happen in the publishing process.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I have another question. I was because Red River, I mean, the river, most of the stories, the narrative is kind of, based on how the river is and what happens by the river. So, and there's also a very interesting convergence of myth, history, and fiction that is evident in the exploration of the themes in the novel. So, I was particularly intrigued by the references you made to the myth of Parashuram and the Kulaluptas, who are called the modern day Kalitas. So, and the way you connected this ancient myth to the present separatism, the politics, and the region is very interesting. But could you elaborate a bit on this and the relevance, again, also the relevance of myths in modern day context, specifically in terms of modern literature?
I mean, this one makes me actually very proud, this particular story, because I wasn't writing a novel. I was on a scholarly expedition, like you would know, like we do our PhDs. I read everything that could be read about Assam. Assam, Bangladesh, this entire area, Bhutan. I was reading not only in English, I was reading in Assamese, which I hadn't done for a very long while. I was reading in Bengali. So I read a lot. And this was an obscure reference, this Kula Lupta, in a folktale book, 30 pages in Assam. See, when I was doing, this is one of the interesting things what happens in when you, Assam is a fascinating place. Like, I grew up in Assam and I love its people and feel that I'm a part of them. So when I went back for my research, I was pretty much I'm a trained anthropologist. So I went to do an ethnography of a small village in Assam. And every house I would go to and I would tell them that I'm writing a book, somebody would say in that household that, yes, we have also written a book, and they would hand me a book, which would be in Assamese, written by grandfather, father, or son. So I had a host of books which I bought back, most of them, some of them self-published, obscure publishing houses. So there was a treasure trove of stories. And this particular story came from one of those folktale books. And the character's name was already Kalita. The myth connected later on. And this is how stories are interconnected. Once you start writing and you start thinking deeply, you find that the stories are interrelated. And therefore, Red River, mythologies, the Kalitas just connected up. This was not planned again. And then it just told you that story of violence, and which is an ancient violence, right? Parashuram's ethnic cleansing of the Kshatriyas connects up to the ethnic cleansing that is very prevalent in the Northeast today, right? So the concept of wiping out a civilization, be it the Palestinians, be it a clan in Manipur today, they all just connect up suddenly, right? Parashuram's story might be a myth and we see it as valor, but what Parashuram was doing was ethnic cleansing. He was paying back a clan for the killing of his father. Right? 21 generations of Kshatriyas were wiped out. But what he found out was that still some remained. Some Palestinians will remain. That's the bloody point. I'm sorry to you, I get this story is close to my heart. So, some Bengalis remained when Assamese went on a killing spree. Some Bengali Muslims lived on in Delhi. So all these myths, ancient myths and modern myths just connected together. But not planned. It's just part of the research. It's suddenly one day I just read this story and like, ooh, everything fell into place.
So, Karthika, do you think that, the way the interweaving of the myth and the history and the fiction, all of it, it actually added, richness and depth at so many levels to the narrative. And I think there were references to other myths, if I can remember correctly, but this is something which I remember very specifically. So do you want to contribute something to this discussion?
No, I just also like the way in which it's been incorporated, as in it is not it is presented as a story, right? Within the story, he's reading it, the history of what happened and so on. So I liked that fact that one was reading it as a contemporary interaction with the myth on the page as a story, rather than trying to make these connections overtly, stretching it. I think sometimes you can go terribly wrong with that. Like you set up this character and then the reader is supposed to realize what the connections are, or the writer gets very heavy handed with it. But I think this distance that was there, this person kind of discovering the story and reading it and understanding it, allows us to be the person who's also reading alongside. And I enjoyed that way in which this was done. I think it's only at the end when you look at a novel and you're doing this, you're reading it carefully, closely, that you realize all these things are happening. When you're reading it, it just kind of blends in at one go, and you don't step back to realize. I think people don't give writers credit for the enormous amount of thought and trial and error that must go into getting every piece right. I mean, that piece could have been written, that scene and that interaction of myth and reality could have been written by different writers, different people, or the same writer in so many different ways. I think to hit upon the actual one that works, I think the effort is not something that we recognize, because we read it as something that is so effortlessly done, and we just go along with it. So what is interesting to me is to understand also why he chose to tell it in that particular way. Sorry?
No, I think somebody is unmuted by
I
mistake.
think Professor Subba is trying to ask a question. Is that
Okay.
yeah?
Okay.
Professor Subba, are you trying to ask a question?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. So we had some, your voice somewhere and we were confused. I think you are unmuted. So I'm just muting you. We'll have a question answer thing later on. Okay, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Batabyal and Karthika. So I have so many questions, of course, so maybe I'll again start by asking one. So this is a really like a very important question for me, because this is something I'm also dealing with in my research. So there are two parts to this question. I'll begin with the first part. So in the novel, Summer is positioned as, somebody who's a subordinate, who plays a subordinate role to Rizu. At least that is the dynamics of their friendship, which is clearly defined in Summer's mind. And he also accepts derogatory remarks about himself, such as Bongal, with a smile. And then there are this interplay of mutual name calling between Summer and Rizu, which also illustrates how the personal, intertwines with the political, despite the seemingly innocuous bond that they share. So I was wondering, what do you have to say about this first? And the second part is, as a migrant, Summer also internalizes a sense of shame. And he says that he cannot be absolved of this shame. Although his friends might at some point be redeemed, even if they do something wrong, he will never be able to absolve himself of the shame as a migrant living in Assam. so the emotion of shame kind of sticks with him. It's a sticky affect. And so could you talk about this also, like how and where does this sense of shame come from? And uh, was this inherited? Was this acquired? How does he come to internalize this? Because shame as an emotion has been repeatedly referred to in the text, and it has been emphasized, whenever we are describing or talking about summer. So these are the two questions I had.
Yeah. So, as a so, I mean, much of Summer's internal feelings, and the way he looks at his childhood and reflects on it comes from a bit of a personal space, definitely the experiential. And I went back to Assam and stayed in Guwahati to kind of rethink this, because memory can be very tricky. So I wanted to be, um, I wanted to really think deeply about it. I think one of the things which happens to Summer throughout, and this happens as much as I interviewed people and talked about it, to minority communities, there's this inherent sense of inferiority. And in India, we know this very well now. For certain communities, things are very difficult, and children there. And childhood is also very cruel. A lot of cruel things happen in our childhood, which we accept. It can happen from parents, it can happen from school, religion. I find childhood extremely, I almost think that a happy childhood is a myth. Kartika, who's very hopeful, always disagrees with me on this. But, there's nothing called a happy childhood. Children just learn to repress. So Summer's relationship with Rizu, who is Assamese, is the relationship the Bengali had to the Assamese in Assam during those times. All of us, our adults, knew how to behave. We knew how to behave. We knew that a certain line cannot be crossed within the Assamese community. We had to always lose to them in sports. We never fought them. And the gundas of the Bengalis areas, the Mastans, would never fight with the Assamese Mastan. Right. So this thing, the lines were so clearly drawn and yet never spoken about. Very rarely was it spoken about. That, the humiliation of parents. When my father is told, do not speak in Bengali in front of his son, and he has to be quiet about it. The humiliation the son feels, the shame for not being able to stand up for the father is immense, and you carry that with you. Your father's shame is yours. And the guilt of not being able to do it. But this is not only for Summer. I think this was for the Marwari community in Assam, Marwari community in Bengal, who were looked, down upon despite all their riches. So it's just a story of the minority community. And as I said, an Assamese in any other part of India might feel the same way as the Northeasterner. Is the distance. It can be the same violence can be inflicted back on them. It's not at all particular to the Assamese. So I guess through Summer, I wanted to talk about the plight. Not plight. I mean, look, Summer also had a lot of joy. His cricket, his. In fact, his shame was so much he wanted to absolve himself by becoming an Assamese. He pretended to be an Assamese. Even today, I speak Assamese as fluently as I speak Bangla or English or Hindi, for that matter. I mean, I have to just step back into Guwahati and I can speak most of the dialects. Forget the plain Guwahati. I can speak in the upper Assam way. I can speak the lower Assam way. It's just because I've internalized it. I so wanted to be a Assamese. You want to absolve yourself of the shame of being a minority. It's like Shah Rukh Khan becoming Rahul, right? He's effaced himself.
Right.
Summer is no Shah Rukh Khan, of course.
And like, how much of you do you find in Summer?
I mean, The physical attributes of Samar were mine. And the mere fact that he, I migrated as an economic migrant to England, but the tragedies of Samar's life were not mine at all. What happens to Samar has nothing to do with me. But they happen to migrant families. They're all real in the sense that it has happened. Violence, much more than I have managed to depict, has happened to migrant families. So, except the fact that Samar could take us through the locations and the spaces and imagine, because I've seen them. I mean, Samar is used more as somebody who has done the research for me. So things don't go wrong. But beyond that, Samar's life is not my own. His story is not my story. My story is very different from Samar's. So none of what happens to Samar has happened to me. I mean, my father has died a peaceful death. And my sister still troubles me. So those stories are all I mean, everything that happens is more or less imagined, but I can say that I have researched all those.
Right. So the sisters part where Tina, that was such a shock for me. I was not able to believe that she would get kidnapped by two seemingly good men suddenly. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling the novel for some of you, but I mean, that was brutal, I must say.
Okay, my sister read this book, of course, and she called me up and said, "What the hell? Why did you get me moved away so quickly?" This is how real life comes in to haunt your story. As children, I mean, my sister and I, along with my mother, we were traveling from Guwahati on a train to Calcutta. My father was already in Calcutta. And there were these two very handsome young men, I think, who traveled with us. I was probably about 10 years old, or 8 or 9 years old, or my sister must have been 2. And this gentlemen were there. They took my sister down into the platform, got her food. We reached Calcutta safely. Now, when I reached my uncle's place, we were mentioning how lovely these 2 young men were. And they were appalled that my mother allowed my sister to be taken down onto the platform at NGP. They said, "Do you know what happens? Kidnappers. And what would you do?" So my childhood self replayed this horror of my sister being kidnapped, right? This never happened and my sister has no clue. She was probably a year old, right? She was an infant. And that played out. And from that, of course, the later happenings started playing out. But then I'd researched the amount of children who have been kidnapped in NGP, those borderlands. That's immense, right? So those stories sprung from there. So there was this moment of not happening, which sparked that and that entire pathway.
Right.
Please don't say for those of you who have not read, we'll keep the mystery of whether Tina is ever found or not.
Yeah. Let's keep that a mystery. Now, I have again another question, and that's for both Dr. Batabyal and Kartika. So, do you believe that literature from this region, from the Northeast, has historically kind of, overlooked the migrant issue? So, and in your view, could this novel, with its hopeful outlook, serve as an influential text for many at this juncture? Because specifically focusing on the migrant issue, not a lot of literature does come, So what are your thoughts on this?
Tom should answer this, because you've probably read a lot more in the area than I have. But it's true that one does not encounter too much serious writing, especially in the literary fiction world or any kind of fiction in India. You don't hear, everyone seems to be writing about worlds that they are aware of and part of. And very often it's not the migrant who's the novelist, but it is the person whose world is being, in a sense, taken over by or stepped into by the migrant who's doing the writing. So recently we published this novel, I can't find it here, but by this writer called Avtar Singh. And it's a novel called Into the Forest. And it's got nothing to do with Assam or any of this, but it's set in a small outskirts of a German town. And it's one of the few novels I've read recently that have come out here, which are about migration squarely, because the main characters are one an Afghan, one Indians, a couple of them, and different Dutch, etc. All of them in that COVID time when you're all kind of caught in one space and you come from different places and you're forced to, in a sense, stay together. I read that novel and I thought the same thing, that so rarely does one encounter writing about migrants in the English language space, at least, except that one reads a lot of fiction about the people who are probably part of the city but came from somewhere else in a very different way, like Delhi, for instance. If you read another river novel, Black River by Nilanjana Roy, that talks about Delhi, and there are people who are from villages nearby who have got jobs in Delhi and who live in Delhi. And I know there are writers who write a lot about Mumbai in that way, of people who have come to kind of live. But I think what Som does is actually foreground that migration and talk about them as migrants, not as somebody who's committed a crime, say, or who's running a bookstore in Bombay or something like that, who is an immigrant. I mean, who has come from somewhere else. But here, the process, the formation, the historical process of it is very much in the front of the narrative. And that, I think, is what distinguishes it from the other fiction. Because I do think at one level, writing in India about any characters in any city or village or town has to necessarily deal with the fact that people have come from elsewhere. At least some of the people in that place would have come from elsewhere. So you can't really leave it out of the narrative, but you can not necessarily make it a major part of what you're thinking about while writing or reading the novel. So you would have a lot more to say on this.
You know what? I mean, it's interesting that we think about it as migrant literature. I was trying to write about three different almost communities, if you want to call it, Assamese, Bengali, and the army as a community, let's say, with all the problems of that framing. And when I went back to Assam, I have been there twice since I wrote the novel. It's been tremendous to see how much the Assamese people felt represented. They said, this is our story for the first time being told of what we went through, right? Similarly, before I published, I had sent this book to few close friends who are senior army officers. And they all felt that these are the traumas we go through. These are the mistakes we make. So in that sense, while Summer does take a lead, perhaps because of me, I did not particularly want to write one community's story, and that's not it. I think the Assamese community, the separatist movement, has been very, very foregrounded through Headmaster Kalita, through Rizu, and the ambiguities the state, the Indian state, I mean, any state can feel while lurching into violence against what they call their own is also there, very much present in that book. So in that sense, I would hesitate to call it a migrant novel, just because I don't think it's a migrant per se story. A migrant is a character in that story. All of us are migrants in that sense. The Ahoms moved from somewhere. And there's an entire history, of King Sukafa onwards, of people, the Ahoms having come in, right? So they are also migrants. The army man is an obvious migrant for professional, is a professional migrant, right? So in that sense, almost all modern novels are migrant stories. I think what I might have foregrounded is the story of a minority community in a certain situation, right? I mean, and power imbalances, look, when the army comes in, the Assamese also become, there's a power imbalance, right? So it always, these things keep happening. So I wanted to talk about this larger story of nation building and what it is to be the Indian nation, which is unity in diversity, Kanyakumari to, I'm forgetting, Kanyakumari to where now? What did we say?
Kashmir.
Kashmir. Kanyakumari, well, that tells you a story. So, if you might allow me, and because again, because of the, normally I wouldn't mention this to in most audiences, but because this is an academic audience, if you, and those of you who have read the book and those of you who might read it, there's a very theoretical framing in the book, which of course I fought hard to conceal. Both Karthik and I wouldn't want it to be overt, but I wanted the framing of the nation state in that first 3 chapters. You see the refugee who wants to be a part of the nation state. Then you see the army man who defends the borders or the nation state, who's a believer in the nation state. And then you see the separatist,
Rebel.
wants to tear away from the nation state fabric. So for me, this was a construction of the nation state itself. And then how those 3 components of the nation state interact with each other, right? So yeah, so those were my thoughts. So for me, per se, I wasn't writing a migrant novel. I had no intention of writing a migrant novel. I wanted to talk about the imagination and the brutality of the concept of the nation state. I find it like religion, it's one of those it's one of those inventions which can be extremely brutal. Brutal, not necessarily in the physical sense, but in how it homogenizes our imagination. So that is what I was working with, and how any deviation can be punished. And Assam is the dominant community is punished very brutally. But nor does the state stay unscarred in that punishment. The shrapnels come back and it haunts.
I think if I may interrupt a little bit, Udita, one
Yes.
of the things I really liked about the novel is also Som talks about this as a minority sort of evocation, but within that also, even if it's the police, for instance, the state and the police representing the state, and therefore there are all these people, arrogant people striding around who are, cops with power. But there is the cop who is caught in between, who respects Kalita sir, who feels, he knows that this is not the way it should be, that this is not the way they should be speaking to him. He feels the horror of the situation, and yet he is the state as well. So I think that is also a strength of the complexity of the novel, that it's never one-dimensional, that there are these other, always these people who are caught. I mean, yes, the Assamese Bengali dilemma, but then there is somebody who's both or grows up as both, then what? If there is a girl like Leela who comes into their life, suddenly Rizu is rendered powerless because he's so taken with her that he can't be himself anymore. Rizu is someone who they both look up to, but then when it comes to that little scene where he's frightened of the water and he, screams and shouts about it, and the other 2 are taken aback, suddenly his power is gone. He's just a little lost person. So I really like the moments where you see the vulnerability over and over again of human beings. In some situations, they're vulnerable, in some they are powerful, but Som never lets them be one thing in one. They're always in here and they're also there, and they occupy different places at different points of time, which I think is also the reason why the novel works so well, because we are really invested in their weaknesses as much as cheering on the things that they do when they're feeling, strong and powerful creatures. Yeah. So I don't know if you agree with this as a conscious thing.
I do very much, Karthik, and thank you for pointing this out, because one of the thing is like, and we talk about agency. I started with the idea of agency, that how little agency one has. These are, when I say the nation state, it's an institution, a community as a whole. People have very little say in how we behave, and the army man from the very beginning feels helpless in a condition of where he knows he's exploiting in Nagaland when we first see Kabir Chaudhary. And Kartika mentions the policeman Moniram. Moniram is my favorite character. I mean, I had such he just takes 3 pages in the book. But I was in Assam when I was writing this, and I was in a small little island, and not one of the biggest islands in Assam called Majuli. And so Moniram was just imagined as I walked around the road alongside another policeman, who used to come in the evenings to walk around, and I used to walk with him. And I just saw the situation from his eyes, things he can't control. I mean, this is nostalgia for me to tell you how I wrote it. But what Kartika points out is that, and this side and that side is only because we are so powerless. We have, what does it? Rizu is today somebody who's an alpha sympathizer, what we call a terrorist. But then there's another moment when you see him lonely in the hills of Bhutan, where he has lost the notion of what freedom means, what he's been fighting for, and what he has been led to believe. Similarly, his father, one of the big financiers of Assam, the insurgency movement, is a broken man at the end. So there's no one left unscarred by history. And yet, I mean, and all of you who are listening to this, who haven't read it, you might think this is a very depressing novel. This is actually a love story with a lot of humor. I think one thing we haven't talked about is the amount of fun the boys have. Wanting to be like Mark Twain's characters, wanting to go out at night and go into haunted houses, falling in love for the first time, playing cricket, cinema halls, first day, first show, Amitabh Bachchan stories. There's a whole section just devoted to childhood romance, So ultimately, this book is also so much about human emotions and love. I mean, the amount of love these boys have for each other and for Leela, and it's just so immense, that Samar leaves Assam and goes away, but he can never leave this alter ego of his, which is Rizu. Similarly, with the army man and the Assamese separatists, their love for each other is so huge. It tears them apart. I mean, somebody wrote to me, said it's a modern day literary Amar Akbar Anthony, So I know you made that face, but it's like this is an entire story of 3 brothers.
Yeah.
So I think now we can open the floor for questions, but we can also first have maybe a reading session, or maybe we can do it at the end, and we can close the discussion.
Yeah, I have to get the book. If you give me a minute, let's do the
yeah.
questions quickly. And
Let's have the questions first. Yes, of course.
Give me 2 seconds. Let me get a copy of the book.
Yeah, sure. I think Professor Lahiri, Professor Himadri Lahiri, not my supervisor. I think Professor Lahiri, did you have a question? I thought you were probably...
I was listening with rapt attention, as you know, and many ideas crossed my mind. No specific question right at the moment, but I would like to raise 1 or 2 questions, 2 issues rather. Can I do that right now?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
First of all, let me admit that I have not read the book, but have got some ideas about the book from different sources, reviews and Facebook sources, etc. So I have some kind of an idea, and I'm very much keen to read the book. As I was listening to you and the kind of impressions that I have about the book without reading it, it appears that the book covers, it's like it has dealt with, it has an epic dimension. Epic dimension in the sense that usually the novels, usually the stories, they deal with one part of the life, either the migrant's life, either the indigenous people's life, things like that. The other novelists, more or less, painted represented the lives from one point of view. But it appears that here there are many, many perspectives. And which is very interesting. It might be a challenge, it might be a real challenge to bring them together, to bring different strands together. And the author must have faced difficulties in doing that. He has talked about the indigenous Assamese people, the natives of Assam. He has talked about the Bengali migrants, about the Indian nation represented through the army, as I gather, as I understand. So these are perspectives which are very difficult to bring together. So my question is, how do you manage it? Because did you feel that at some points of time while writing the novel, you felt nervous or disappointed because bringing them together, because the relationship is not is many-sided. There are problems of friendship. There are friendships, and there is conflict between the communities and individuals as well. So taking all these points together, how did you feel? What was the kind of experience that you had while writing the book? This is my just a kind of question.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Larry. I do hope you'll read the book and you'll come to your own conclusions on how I have managed to convey the different aspects of the story. I felt no conflict or I felt no difficulty in portraying each character as fully as I possibly could. I have, as I said, as a Bengali, I wanted to be an Assamese. So I fully invested in that emotion. During my college years in Delhi, my best friend and my roommate was an army boy, and I spent 3 years with him in very close friendship. His father was a brigadier. So I got to know as a journalist in Delhi, I covered the defense for a long while. So I took all of that research very seriously. And I thought about my best friend, army boy, when I wrote the best friend, army man's story. I thought about my best friend, Assamese, Ribjit Kalita was his name, and he sat next to me in school. He's a very tall, strong fellow. And now when I return with the book to Assam, he comes and sits. And so, I had no trouble in imagining the events of the book and how it would affect them, right? I didn't want, as I said, I didn't want to portray a particular community and the harassment or whatever they have gone through. I wanted to talk about a situation, a time in history, and how it might. My hope was that because it's so universal, it would appeal to everyone. So, and I think to a certain extent, I hope people are telling, is that when the Assamese come and tell me that we felt represented, 4 professors of Cotton College met me for dinner and just said how brilliant, that it was a story of their times. I met in visits where people would actually shout out and tell me that they're very angry, and I said, why? And they'd say, you made me cry because this is my story. Though I never grew up in Guwahati, I grew up in Tezpur. So those validated what I felt. And as I said, there's an enormous love that I have for Assam and the Assamese. Enormous love for my friends who have been in the army, and I know their personal stories and their discomforts. So yeah, so it wasn't difficult. It was just that whether I would be able to, whether I had the talent literally to fully realize what I felt. That, you can have emotions and feelings, whether it's translatable in writing is the test, and Wordsworth said that you can have all primary emotions. The secondary emotion is being able to write. So this has been the challenge.
So I have
And just observation, you see, I've always felt that the river, that any river in Assam has a huge life, and it's part of the people there. When we visit places like Tejpur, for example, the myths of Shonit district, and the myths of blood flowing through the river. And if we come to the Brahmaputra Valley, we have different kinds of life of the river. And I personally experienced how the river was a powerful presence there. We lived in Pandu, very near the Brahmaputra River. And during the rainy season, we witnessed things, houses, animals being washed along the river. So that had a kind of a presence on the minds of the people there. So added to that, you have the term red, okay, which has multiple connotations carried from both the myths and the real life situations, the ethnic violence and everything like that. So on the one hand, the river, and on the other hand, the wildlife, the elephant that features on the cover page. You can see elephants in places like Tejpur or Jorhat walking through the main road. So you see that these are real presence in the actual life. How much of these are, since I have not read the book, how much of these are represented in the novel in order to reinforce the kind of the stories that you told?
Very much. I mean, Professor Larry, now I have to ask you to read the book. So, there's no,
Sure.
I'll say yes, it's been represented, and I've spoken about this very much so. Now, once you'll be the judge once you read.
Sure. I will.
Okay, I have this question. It was wonderful listening to all of you, and I'll definitely read the book. And I have a kind of a different experience growing up in Guwahati, barring the short period during which the ASU movement happened, when there were assaults, on sections of Bengalis. There were raids in the Assam Engineering College. I remember my uncles were studying there, and it was generally a time of insecurity, and I grew up, and there used to be play areas where Bengalis stayed were especially targeted, and I remember that there would be nightly sort of people would patrol, and they would try to see that nothing happened. All of these I did grow up with, but other than that, having studied in St. Mary's, later having gone to Cotton College, and I still have a lot of friends, and we are on the same WhatsApp group still now. I have never felt pressurized to speak in Assamese, although we spoke Assamese, as a matter of course, all of us did. But all of my Assamese friends also knew Bengali, and they would occasionally speak in Bangla. So I think I have a different, I looked at it from a different perspective. On the contrary, I have often seen that, Bengalis insisted on speaking in Bangla right in front of Assamese people, and assumed that they would understand. They did, but I thought at that point I felt awkward occasionally because this happened. Now, often, when I have when there has been discussions regarding this, I have often felt that it's not just the majority trying to sort of impose its ways on the minority, but there has been a resilience within minority, in this case, the Bengalis. I'm talking about Bengali Hindus especially, because that the riverine area, the migration from Bangladesh, that again is a very different story. So, but anyway, that's my experience. I'm sure
No, but your experience is not, not to be discounted, or not that it's not part of it. Maligaon Railway Bengali employees are a very different story. Not only were you away from Guwahati, but you were enclosed in a very Bengali community. So I know that story also. But
I did study in St. Mary's,
of course you did.
Guwahati. It is
But
definitely not a Bengali community there.
I'm not
An
discounting
overwhelmingly
that,
Assamese batch.
I'm not
and
discounting
Cotton
that.
College as well. But then I did have Bengalis who insisted on speaking in their language, and there were problems.
Why not? And why shouldn't Bengali speak in their language? Why shouldn't
Why
Assamese?
not? Why not? I'm just saying that
No.
I didn't have that experience. But I'm saying, I mean, that's separate. I'm sure. I mean, we can have different experiences.
Let me just
Yeah.
answer that.
Sure.
Even in the book, there are moments when Rizu wants to speak Bangla, right? So it's not a discounted. Your experience doesn't discount somebody else's, or
No, it
that's
doesn't. No, I'm not saying.
yeah. So I think what is important, and as Kartika was saying, is that there is no one aspect. It's
No.
not a story of Assamese oppression on the Bengalis. The entire early Assamese culture and the way language developed was because of Bengali oppression. It was the Bengalis who were the Babus in Assam during the when the early Mughals came in and the English came in. So there's a lot of Bengali dominance which went on before pre-1940s. So so there's a lot of stories behind and myths behind. I don't think there's a discounting of this or that, but it's an amalgamation of.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Historically speaking, since I've also written about the language movement in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, a lot of it, a lot of the so-called Bengali conspiracy to dismantle Bengali Assamese and make Bengali the official language of communication has been, debunked, and it's considered to be a myth, historically speaking. But that's a different story. I mean, Lokinath was anger against Rabindranath, saying that this was a dialect corruption of Bengali. We won't go into all of that. But how much of it, you're saying that the Assamese, the so-called ethnic Assamese, as they would be called, how would you say the reaction is very positive? I mean, I'm really amazed. Wouldn't there be a backlash when you talk about it, given the fact that this is still a very, very emotionally fragile topic to talk about?
Well, there hasn't been. I mean, Cotton College is bringing it
That's
up.
interesting. That's interesting.
Not because I think, I mean, what it was is a story of their times. It's not a story of Bengal. I mean, this is I mean, one of the difficulties is talking about a book which some of you haven't read. So it's difficult to, you're thinking communities. It's not. The Assamese were, I mean, the reviews which came out, the fact that Cotton College is taking it out as a text next year in the English department.
That's really very healthy. I mean, that's really a nice thing.
The idea being that it's a story of a particular time, not of a particular community. This is what I'm trying to say, that it's not a migrant community story. It's not a Bengali in Assam story. It's a story about the late 1980s and 90s in Assam. And
actually, that's precisely what I was saying. Barring those times, which were very, very politically volatile, the late 80s, the early 90s and all that, we really did not, that was the time when one felt a certain kind of tension constantly, although not among friends. I didn't see that. And most of my friends were Assamese. But barring that, I mean, I think, it would be appropriate to call it, without reading it, the way you discuss it, I'll tell you later on whether I agree or with it or not. But calling it the story of the times, calling it the story of the times, I think really makes sense to me, given the fact that, and the reaction, positive reaction, is definitely very nice to hear about. Anyway, that's all. Well, wonderful. I'll definitely read. Udita, and anybody from the
yes,
audience?
any other questions?
Could I ask
Anybody?
a question?
Yeah.
Hi. Just give me a second. Let me see if I can see everything. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Batabyal, and
hi, Arko.
Hi. This is Arko. I teach in this department, and because I work on literary studies, I think my questions would be on that. Without having read the novel, again, apologies. I mean, this was a very interesting and very enjoyable conversation. I'm looking forward to reading the novel. But I have two slightly generic questions that I'm generally kind of interested in terms of the process of writing the book and in the specific case of this novel. And the third question might be a little bit more specific, but please forgive me, since I've not read the book, it might be inaccurate, as simple as that. The first question is about how you place yourself as an anthropologist and a novelist, and how do you see the dialogue between these two identities of yours, and how much of your anthropological training, in a way, may not be consciously, but how much of it may unconsciously go into your novel? That's the first question. Yeah.
Should we take it one by one?
Sure, sure.
I think being an anthropologist, ethnographer, understanding power relationships between the anthropologist and those communities you're in are very important. Theoretically, it is very important. I also have been a journalist before this for about 10 years. So I am able to research well, I think, and I give a lot of, so in journalism, you do a very quick kind of research. You get a sense of a story very quickly. An anthropologist does it very differently. And both those senses, I think, play out well. When I'm trying to think of a novel, I manage to last out longer than journalists would in most situations. So for example, in this story, I actually brought a little piece of land in Assam, which since has, God knows what has happened to it, but I kind of constructed a hut and lived with my then pregnant wife in the summer heat in Assam, in a very small village in Upper Assam, to get a sense. 107 families in a village, interviewed each of them, knew their history very well, Muslim side, Ahom side, Bagania side, which is the workers of Assam, the tea workers. So that is one aspect, that is research, but good research doesn't make a good novel. So you have to kind of also then emerge out of it and think through what is the larger story that you want to say. So good research just bolsters novels, that you don't make silly mistakes. That is one. I didn't want to make silly mistake. I have made one little mistake, which has been pointed out. And that's because of not knowing what vegetables grew at what time of the year. So I made one mistake, which a very astute reader has said, at that time, that vegetable might not have grown that fresh. So, but all anthropology is basically what they call faction, because anthropology is also a narrative. You tell a particular narrative while not necessarily leaving out others. A narrative dominates. Other narratives go into the background. So I'm very conscious when I'm telling a story that this is one story, that there are many other possible stories which could have been told. I try as much as I can to give voice. When I'm an anthropologist, articulates particular cultures, and they have a power, therefore, of articulating. I'm aware of my power of articulation. So I'm very conscious that I do not do something offhandedly, say the wrong thing, because a line can delineate an entire community, right? So I don't want to frame things, because framing is, an anthropologist frames people. Western anthropology has framed the global South. And we are, as T.S. Eliot says, you're wriggling on a wall. So I'm aware of those theoretically, and in one sense, it's very difficult, because when you are so aware, you can't write. That's why it took me 13 years. I possibly, if I had not been an anthropologist and a researcher, I would have written this a bit quicker, and it would have been probably the same novel. Who knows, But yeah, I'm aware of power relations, articulation theory. That's what academia gives you. But I'm also a journalist who is used to writing 1,000 words a day. So all of that makes it what it is. But the fact that when I wrote about Assam in that particular moment, I just wanted to capture everything through small voices here and there.
Yeah. So the second question is somewhat related, and I was thinking of the conversation and way, I think it was Karthika possibly who called it a literary novel. And I was just wondering about this, slight bit of tension if we look at the history of the literary novel. It has always had a very tenuous and a very complex relationship with explicit historical contextualization, which I guess is quite central to a novel of this kind. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Again, this comes from someone who hasn't read the novel. But following the conversation, I thought there was, or there is, a very committed historical contextualization or social political contextualization in a novel like this. And this is a question about the craft. How does one switch between that and the literary novel? Of course, I'm not trying to say that it cannot be done. I'm just wondering how you did it.
Well, so I was, again, writing about a particular time. So it's a moment in history, you're right. And that time in history is obviously affected by other things which have happened historically. Partition, 1971, the Assam movement, India's independence, the Sikh 1984 events in Delhi. So to me, it was a post-partition novel, and all that happened post-1947. Of course, there's a bigger story of colonialism there, but all of this is the background. And I was acutely aware of the history and how it has affected my characters, though they might be unaware of it. So in that sense, these characters are all prisoners of history, or all prisoners might be a wrong word, are all products of history. A literary novel, I don't know. I mean, you don't, people now have these genres of writing, crime writing, chick lit, this, that. I just wrote a story that I don't know if it's a literary fiction, or if it's a historical fiction, or if it's a romantic novel, or it's a love story, or a migrant fiction for that matter. You just write a story the way it comes to you. And I've written a crime story. What I thought was a socio-political narrative has become a crime story before, like The Price You Pay. So I don't literally think that I'm going to write an out-and-out literary fiction. It's just probably that's the way marketing team, or you would think about it. That's the genre you are placed in. For me, it's just a story, another story.
Because it's also a genre-less genre. I mean, literary novel is not like a crime novel, right? Or not like a whodunit.
Or could be, when Nilanjana Roy writes Black River, it becomes a literary fiction. It's a crime fiction, becomes a literary fiction, Ian Rankin, John le Carré.
But there we are talking about multi-generic fiction, right? Or a sort of what Hallquist and others following Bakhtin would call a kind of metaphysical whodunit. But literary fiction, in that sort of classic Derridian way, participates in different genres without necessarily belonging in one of them. But of course, it participates, as you rightly say. The third question, I'll be quick with this. I don't want to take all the time. There might be other questions from others. Is a slightly complex question. And let me try and articulate it to the best of my abilities at the end of a long and slightly tiresome day. I'm sorry. So there is this post-colonial idea of the Indian English, diasporic English language novel as a kind of national allegory. That was at least the first generation post-colonial novel writing back and so on and so forth, which has been, of course, immensely complicated by the Bhasha literary traditions. And this question comes from your comment that in a way you were trying to write one of the Upanishas, so to speak, in the 50s, 60s, one of those long narratives and so on, a story, right? The receipt, so to speak. So again, I'm kind of wondering where you see this novel complicating that rather simplistic idea of national allegory, the post-colonial novel as a national allegory. And I'm kind of saying this because at certain points, the nation state was evoked, right? And in the discussion, I think it was said that there is, of course, a certain way in which this is a novel about India, not just about Assam, right? So how does the Bhasha literary tradition or the regionality of it interact with this sort of national imagination, so to speak? Thank you.
Orko, this is for you to say, as I'm not a literary theorist, I might have read Bakhtin, but I'm not I'm no longer an English lit student or a professor. I wish you'd be able to tell me what it does. All I can say is that, books are written in time and places, and you stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So what has happened prior, from Rushdie to Ghosh to Seth, Arundhati Roy, the big ones, and so many lesser known writers, they've all kind of crept in different ways to fill your head and mind. And you write from those positions, unconsciously, consciously, whatever you have read, you're just a product of that. I don't know how it problematizes that narrative. I don't know what, when we talk bhasha, I think a lot of freedom has been allowed in the way I have managed to use language because of other writers who have taken the liberty to use English in many different ways, not least Amitav Ghosh, to whom I owe a huge tribute that, he kind of opened my eyes to the ways, not only the ways the English language can be tampered with, but also the possibilities of writing stories that I wanted to write in English that people would read. So I guess this is all part of a continuation product of.
And Bengali or Assamese language writers who influenced you, who inspired you, who are perhaps at some level ghosting in a novel like this?
Nabakanta Borua, Nilomani Phukon, writers like Sunil Ganguly, of course, hugely. Purva Paschim influenced me hugely, and the serialized nature of Purva Paschim had tones of Dickens to it. So there's a lot, if I start talking, this could be we should have a cup of tea and have this discussion on influences and effects. But yes, and again, the ability to switch dialects are very important in this book. The difference between cha and sa is just very small, but there's a whole world of politics which happens in that, right? Luchi and puri are very similar. Luchi aludam, puri sabzi. So all of this plays a huge part in that. But the word I like is sa and cha. So much happens in that. And I use both the cadences of both Bengali and Assamese very much. One of the huge moments of this book rests on misunderstanding the word sale. Sale in Hindi is an abuse. Sale in Assamese is to have seen, to have been witness. This produces a huge amount of violence which affects the book, right? So language plays a huge part. Right. So not necessarily in bhasha novel, as you're trying to say, but bhasha itself, and the impossibility of being able to communicate sometimes from where you are and how you are.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Batabyal, Kartika, Udita, Madhumakavi. It's wonderful to have all of you, and I'll take my leave. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. If there are questions.
If I may, I will ask a question, but that is definitely not at the cost of Dr. Batabyal reading out a little bit of his work, because hearing from a writer is some of the best things reading his book is one of the best experiences one has. So if he allows that, then I'll ask a very minor question.
Please, Sharmita. Please.
I'm Sharmita. Sorry, I can't put the camera on, bandwidth issues. And I'm a prospective reader. The reason I haven't read it is because Udita is investing in it so much. And when I invest in a fiction, and then it becomes close to my heart, then I have a certain lens of looking at it. So right now I need her to have her voice because she's doing that. So I want to ask you, and this is not about migrant fiction, this is not about any of these things. You just said it's also a love story, right? And the reason, and that brought me back a certain thing that once, long time back, when I was teaching, introduction to fiction, Indian fiction at University of Houston as a graduate student, I was very, very, very tense to introduce Ghore Baire, Home and the World. And one of the things, because my advisor says, introduce it as a love story, a love triangle, and then go into it. And that literally worked. So as your prospective reader, who's not currently forgotten about Udita's dissertation, is like, how would you tell me about, entering the book as a perspective, as a love story?
Thank you. You mentioned Ghore Baire, which is one of my favorite.
And you mentioned Purva Paschim, which is one of my favorites. You just won my heart also there. So love becomes very pertinent at this point.
Yeah. So I think it's a love story of different. It's not a typical love story only between man and woman or boy and girl. It's a love story about three young boys who love each other dearly across very strong divides. It's a love story also between man and woman and different boys and girl, in that there are love triangles, and it's a very difficult love triangle which ultimately leads to deaths and killings. So it's a very strong emotion. It's a mother's love for a boy, that the mother is willing to do anything for a child, which is what I would not have been able to write, I think, if I didn't have a boy. I know that feeling a mother or a father can have, and what the father has. It's also about what my father passed in the very outset of as I was writing this book, and his spirit dominated the book. The love the boy has for his dead father, whose father who dies in the middle of the novel in very brutal ways, vanishes. It's so overwhelming. It's so paralysis inducing. When it holds you, it just clenches your heart in such ways. All of this, this different forms of love, I really wanted to explore this. Love for motherland, the concept of mother, all of these things. So ultimately for me, it was this love story, people's love for different things in different ways. And I wanted to go beyond man-woman love.
That's wonderful to know. Thank you so much. And if we could hear you read out a little bit, because, I have been in a graduate program where there was a bunch of creative writers, and I saw my friends reading their work, and that passion is unparalleled. So if you could treat us to that, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And definitely I'm your prospective reader after Udita writes her chapter. That's the thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamita. I'm going to read two little short sections then. One which Udita recommended, the Paichari one, which is right at the end of the book, which the boy thinks about his father walking. And I literally knew my father who did Paichari, which, and I'll talk about that. But the first one, and this might address one of your, what you were saying, Shamita. This is about the city and Guwahati. Just two paragraphs, how Guwahati is introduced in this book and the new boy who is coming in, the army boy. So this is about Guwahati. Madhumita, you might find traces of Guwahati in this. Guwahati had never intended to be a city. The very name discouraged ambition. Gua, betel nut, and Hati, market. That was the vision. For a long time, it managed this mediocrity adequately. Its residents were satisfied with the town's average amenities, a few cinema halls for entertainment, schools and colleges, some of them good, a second-rate sports stadium, a hospital that treated the rich as disdainfully as it did the poor, three main markets, used as much for gossip as commerce, and most importantly, time, a lot of it to chew the stubborn betel nut. When change arrived, it visited every doorstep in Guwahati. Overnight, families became rich. On the roads, motorbikes appeared, and later, cars. Inside homes, televisions, and even air conditioners arrived. Buildings grew taller, and men, having acquired guns, appeared bigger. Some lost a limb to a crude homemade bomb. Others were taken in the middle of the night. Many said Guwahati's ancient protector, the goddess Kamakhya, had abandoned her temple, angry at the barricades and checkpoints erected between her and her people. The mighty Brahmaputra flowed as before. Only the boatmen knew that the water was a shade darker. Sorry, that the waters were a shade darker. The two boys, however, paid no heed. The bombs always went off elsewhere, and who could be bothered to kidnap them? Youngsters did vanish, but rarely from their school, and curfews meant street cricket. But change spared no one, and for these two, that is Samardatta and his best friend Rizu Kalita, it arrived with the new boy. So that's the section on Guwahati. And now, if I may, can I read a small section on Paichari, which was mentioned by Udita?
Okay, please do.
So this is the penultimate page, okay? And this is from an excerpt from his summer's diary, which he used to write very quietly. In Bengali, there's a word for walking, Paichari. It is not like an evening or morning stroll, because Paichari can happen in extremely confined spaces. Unlike its closest equivalent in English, pacing, which denotes tension and worry, Paichari is contemplative, thoughtful. That is how I think of Baba. Walking those few feet that were available in our house in Guwahati, round and round, his hands joined at the back, deep in thought. Or he's singing, full-throated, his arms in the air. Baba loved Paichari. And even when the use of his legs were taken from him, the cot of his crutches could be heard outside our room in Kodumtala. Somewhere where there's an eternal, unending sunset, Baba continues his Paichari. That's all.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Somnath, if I may call you that, you're reminding me of the time when I did my higher secondary exam, one of the papers in Cotton, and the history department, I'm sure if you studied in Cotton, you would know, history department is a little away. We came out and curfew had been declared. It was emergency time. And I came home and and later on when I came back to Assam, my mama bari is still there. I said, so green. And my cousin said, it's more olive than green. And that's so true. And Paichari, of course, I can, in my family too. So lovely to hear both these passages. And without reading, I mean, I can kind of sense what is there. And at the first opportune moment, I'm going to get that book, certainly. But I would really want you to come and visit our campus so that we can have an in-person discussion more about this book and a lot other. I think we need to end the session. We've taken up a lot of your time and Karthika's too. But thank you really, and thanks to all of you, all the audience members who have participated. Thanks a lot to all of you, and to Dita too. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks, Shobita.
Bye.
Bye, Karthika. Lovely to have you both.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.